Marx observed that what he called the reserve army of unemployed disappeared because they went in the factory door and got jobs. Well, what does a reserve army of unemployed do for employers? Well, in many ways, Marx observed high unemployment was actually beneficial to employers because it keeps down wages, as I talked about before. It gets employees to the existing employees to work much harder. And these are what Marx called, and Marxian economists called, reserve army effects. So to summarize here then, a boom of the economy reduces the reserve army effects. And how does that lead to economic problems? Well, it reduces profitability. And then employers will see that and they'll say, this is not a good time to invest because profits are low. They'll seek to replace workers with machines. They'll flee to low-wage regions. And all of that generates higher unemployment. So in this sense, capitalism is an inherent, has an inherent process that creates a business cycle with periods of high unemployment. Okay, so that's some analytical theory, and if we had a longer period of time tonight, I'd be snowing you with graphs, but I thought it would be good maybe to skip that. But just to make a connection between this sort of abstract set of views to what actually goes on now, and some of you I think are quite familiar with this. One of the things that we have is a Federal Reserve System, which is a very controversial entity. And there's some good reasons for it to exist, and there's some good reasons to be critical of it. And you know, Ron Paul's always like 1/4 right about some of the things he's talking about. I spent a lot of my time in the classroom trying to explain to my students why Ron Paul is not the savior. As cool as he may be on things like marijuana laws or whatever. But when you're talking about the Federal Reserve, one of the things that employers have got the Federal Reserve to do, its most powerful economic institution in our society, is to watch for when labor costs rise. All right? There's a measure called unit labor costs. Federal Reserve watches this very closely, and as soon as it starts to go up, which happens when we have the economy approaching towards full employment, it turns up the dials. It raises interest rates and purposely pursues higher unemployment. Why? To reduce labor costs. Okay? So that's part of our modern policy. Let's look at the current crisis now. Chicago School, and I'll keep going back to that point, the utopian theory of the economy, says that the current crisis and any economic crisis is caused by over-regulation and over-involvement in the economy from the government. So, for example, here's a narrative that you can turn into a certain cable news station and probably hear over and over again, or read a certain newspaper or blog. The current crisis was caused by government involvement in housing. Right? Clinton and that crazy guy, George W. Bush, just got the government's nose involved where it shouldn't. It was promoting home ownership, right? And indeed, President Clinton and President Bush were very much, because it was politically popular to talk about, pushing the government to assist more and more people to own homes. And the claim there is that everything bad that happened on Wall Street that led up to the collapse came from government sticking its nose in. And then they talk a lot about this institution called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two institutions that were set up by the government, became private corporations, did a bunch of stupid things, were part of the problem, although not the only source of it. But it allows them to create a narrative that says that government efforts led us into this crisis, and now we're not recovering, goes the story, because Obama's been making things worse, right? How's he made things worse? He's created new regulations, and the job creators freak out when they see more regulations coming down the line and they stop hiring people. He, through his 2009 stimulus legislation, did a couple of things. One of the things he did is that he did expand unemployment insurance. Many more people were covered nationally, and especially the length of time lengthened from 26 to 52 weeks to up to 99 weeks, depending on the state and the person. So with many long-term unemployed, a lot of long-term unemployed have actually collected unemployment. And that's thanks to measures that the Obama administration took. Well, you understand the Chicago School believes that that actually causes unemployment. And of course, Obama's built up the debt, and that's freaked everybody out as well. Moving to reality-based views, the Keynesian and Marxian views of the crisis, Wall Street since 1980 has been unleashed. All right, we learned a lesson in the Great Depression in the 1930s, and we regulated banking, and we broke up banks that were too big to fail. That has been reversed since the 1980s, especially a 1990 law that repealed the separation of investment and regular banking. Anybody know the name of that act? You guys are great. So no quiz at the end of the night tonight. Okay, so this led to the return of financial bubbles and increasingly worse recessions over the last several decades. You're familiar with, in the 1980s, there was a savings and loan collapse that directly came out of deregulation because all kinds of speculation came from people buying savings and loans banks and using them to buy junk bonds, and junk bonds were used to finance speculation, and it all came down at the end of the 80s. Caused a recession. There was the bubble in the high-tech industry at the end of the 90s, and then the unprecedented, unless you go back to the Great Depression, collapse of housing and Wall Street. For Marx and Keynes, this is something we would fully expect to happen in a free market economy. And this is why the Chicago School is a utopian view. There's another source of imbalance that's worth talking about that's very much involved the working class. And that is that wages stopped going up for workers in the 1970s because of the successful class warfare waged by employers. And then this new trick, so the financial sector comes and say, look, wages are not going up, but we'll give you more and more credit. And that credit has been used to fuel the bubbles, and particularly the housing bubble. If you follow this story, if you read any of the wonderful, splendid journalistic books on the financial crisis, The Big Short, Too Big to Fail, there's just a whole series of them that tell the story quite well. For Wall Street to create all those inventions, the mortgage-backed securities and the credit default swaps and all those things that built this big house of cards that created the downdraft that unemployed so many people, they needed mortgages. And they were going out there and selling people mortgages who were never going to be able to pay them. The experts in the financial industry knew that, knew they were committing fraud. And if you know some of the fallout of that, I mean, obviously there's whole communities around the country that have been destroyed by the overexuberance of the financial system and the fraud committed on workers. So finally, how did we get here? Well, from a Marxian point of view, you always look at the political and economic efforts of classes. And when the New Deal got put into place, that gave rights to workers to join unions, unions expanded, that supported the creation of programs that would create a safety net. I'll talk about this a little bit in a minute. Economic security for workers was considered so anathema to business interests that business began to mobilize politically to destroy this system. They pushed for deregulation on a whole series of fronts, from getting rid of financial regulation, from getting rid of workers' safety and union rights, and certainly trying to push back environmental regulation. We know they put billions into politics, both directly into political action committees that directly affect campaigns, very powerful lobbies. Interesting moment in modern times. In 1972, there was something called the Business Roundtable, which has been massively influential in all these matters at the federal level. It was formed, they said, we need the top 200 CEOs in the country from the biggest companies to be a political entity and to lead the effort to push back all of these regulations. And then to create a way of thinking about this, right-wing think tanks were financed and created. There's the Heritage Foundation, the national level, the Maine Heritage Policy Center at the Maine level. You're familiar with these groups. University economics departments like the Chicago School got flooded with money and they could train a lot of graduate students. American Enterprise Institute and so forth. And then we also know that there's a right-wing media to share that with the rest of us. So for fixing the problem, we see the Chicago School saying, just get rid of government, right? Just shut it down, get rid of unemployment insurance, and the job creators will go crazy and we'll be fine. Not very realistic. For Keynesians, we're familiar with what gets advocated here. If anybody's read Paul Krugman, he does a pretty good job of giving an explanation to the average person of this. We obviously need to restore financial regulations, and while we got a lot of financial regulations in 2010, there's a lot more that need to be implemented. I do have high hopes, as a lot of folks do, for the Consumer Protection Organization that Elizabeth Warren put together. We have banks that are too big to fail, and we need to break them up. This is a really big issue here, and I can't stress it enough. There's all this talk about the debt. People don't like debt. Debt is bad. Debt is immoral. Debt is going to lead to something. But in the short run, the only way that we can get a recovery of the economy is for the federal government to borrow more money, which it can do it for almost free. The whole world is still willing to lend us all the money that we want. In the short run, to get the economy to recover. In the Great Depression, we had originally the jobs programs, the WPA employing 7 million people. That was followed by World War II, the most massive moment of government intervention and deficits in our history. And we need a repeat of that in the short run. All this debt talk, if we acted on the motive to reduce the debt, we would push unemployment back up over 10% in a heartbeat. Maybe somebody can ask me about this during the question and answer, but we need to do something about the housing market, because the housing market will ensure, because it's in such a bad shape. Housing prices are still going down in this country 4 years into the crisis, 5 years actually since the housing prices started to go down. And the problem there is that until that reverses, we're not getting jobs back. I mean, if you want to point to one thing that's limiting us from recovering in jobs, it is the housing crisis, which has not ended. And the upshot of that is that right now, economists are predicting that it's 7 to 10 years before employment gets back to where it was before the recession started. Finally, a radical view on all this is that even if we have successful reform, beginning with full employment, beginning with restoring unemployment benefits to where they should be, corporations are still free to use their billions and their inherent economic power to attack these programs and conditions. And we need working class political and social movements to make class gains possible, but also to protect class gains if we're so lucky to be able to achieve them. In short, it's up to the working class, its representatives, you in this room, to make full employment a demand and make it impossible for the political system to say no. To just finish here, we know that with Occupy in Wisconsin, and what's happened in the Midwest with the attack on public sector unions and the really remarkable response of working class activists in those states, it's changed the terms of the discussion, but it's just a whiff of what we really need to turn things around. And so the last that I'll have here is we have all this discussion about the Frances Perkins Center, and Frances Perkins herself tonight, and she is such a great touchstone to look at these events. One of the things that's most remarkable about what happens in the 1930s is you had this alliance between leaders of vision who knew the specifics of what to do, and Frances Perkins was very much part of that, although there was a great many number of others that historians love to research and talk about. But there was also folks on the outside. Frances Perkins is known for Social Security. And the word security was like the 99% now. It was a slogan in the 1930s. It represented something. The working class really wanted to solve the problem that it faced, which is that people over 50 in the Great Depression, the majority of them were unemployed. A safety net was no abstract thing to them. And they knew that for all the Frances Perkins in government, it was only going to be a broad social movement that included the labor movement, but also there was an organization called the Townsend Clubs. And there were many other organizations like it that had 5 million members. Those organizations wrote letters to Congress, went and spoke to their Congress people, demonstrated, and they insisted that social security and economic security was an inevitable force that all politicians had to reckon with. And while Frances Perkins was advocating for this and FDR was happy to go along, it was that political pressure which changed a Congress that allowed for that to happen. So as much as we may have allies in the White House, don't expect them to do much unless we're out in the streets. Thank you very much.